Hello and welcome to Seven. I'm the principal, Matthew Mills, and just in case you didn't know what I look like, this is a picture of me, 25-year veteran of financial services, although you wouldn't know it from the picture, but what can I say? I moisturise. This is part of our ongoing lecture series, and they are lectures. And I thought in this context it'd be really interesting to have a muse on what's been going on for the first two courses of this year. And when I was thinking about the content for this lecture, it really kind of struck me that if you look at the market turbulence, the economic uncertainty, and the grim news flows over the last 6 months, you could become convinced that the world is going to hell in a chicken basket. And even the most hardened investor might be experiencing some reservations and anxieties, and there probably need to be a few words speaking to that. Now, you might not be immediately familiar with this chap or the name Daniel Kahneman, but I thought this would be a really great place to start. Uh, he is a Nobel Prize-winning economist, and he conducted seminal work on investor behavior. Specifically, he focused on what are called attributions, which are the explanations we give to ourselves about what's going on with our money. The principal thing that he found was that often investors behave in an irrational way, usually because they don't have enough information to make a rational choice and they fall back on their emotions. Now, this is manifest nowhere more prominently than when markets dip. And without a detailed explanation or understanding of what's actually happening in markets, people will fall back on their feel and will tend to make choices which are not necessarily in their best interests. The Dalbar Institute, for example, estimates that about 25% of the gains that are available in markets every year, investors fail to make them through dumb emotional decision making where they don't understand what's going on. Now, another name that really crops up at dinner party conversations is Robert Schiller, which is this chap here. Now, again, he's not a client. He is a highly respected economist who's also won a Nobel Prize, however. Now, his work focused on narratives. These are the explanations we give each other. And again, there are also undercurrents that these are less than entirely logical. Now, a great example of this is during the Great Depression, when sales of Ford motor cars fell by 84% and didn't actually recover for yet another 6 years. Now, you might not be surprised at that because this was the Great Depression, but the statistic becomes really surprising when you recognize that the social demographic, the group of people in the population who actually had the money to buy cars, still had plenty of money throughout this entire period. However, the predominating narrative, how things were explained between people and how they perceived themselves, was that purchasing a car would appear to be vulgar when large swathes of the population were impoverished. So we had a narrative of frugality, which affected people's attributions, the way they explained things to themselves, that also impacted at least part of the market. Now, those narratives we were talking about were at a time when maybe there were telephones and maybe the distribution of narratives was maybe limited a little bit. But with the explosion of the internet and particularly social media, access to narrative content has increased exponentially, hence this diagram. With almost anyone now able to easily create and distribute content through the likes of YouTube, for example, this narrative is as diverse as its authors. And the very fact that I'm doing this presentation really serves to demonstrate that fact. The sheer quantity of material available makes it very difficult also to find a reliable source. And the problem is compounded by myriad streams of narrative, personal and commercial, driven by a desire for attention in one form or another. Reliable, rigorous reporting and stoic delivery that maybe we saw on the BBC News when I was a kid really is often given way to sensational headlines crammed between advertisements. Attention clearly has become of commercial value, perhaps justifying it as a modern commodity in and of its own right, but making the underlying agenda of any narrative much more ambiguous at the same time, and its impact on our attributions, how we feel and how we act about our money, also more difficult to predict. Now, I haven't actually made this up. This is a real headline from a real paper, but it goes to underscore that understanding contemporary economic narratives is important for investors. The explanations to which we pay attention will impact the ones we give ourselves, our attributions, and how we act on them. As a case in point, I got an email recently from a product provider telling me that global events were unprecedented. Now they're not, but for a moment my attention was focused on a message which was ultimately aimed at selling me a product. Now on reflection, there have been dips in and significant bouts of volatility in markets before. Great Depression is a great example, we've touched on that. There have been bottlenecks in commodity markets, which have driven up energy prices and inflation. And we saw that in the 70s as a case in point when flows of oil from the Middle East slowed down a little bit. We had petrol prices being driven up in the States. And indeed, in a world which has enjoyed only a few days without a major war since 1945 and none without conflict, and without diminishing any of the human suffering involved, absolutely wouldn't do that. But armed conflict actually seems to be rather to set a precedent than to be unprecedented. So when the narrative filter is removed, in fact, the attribution for an investor becomes quite anodyne and mundane. Markets fluctuate in value in the short term, sometimes dramatically, but always revert to mean and an average trajectory which rises in the medium to long term. And you can see that in any assessment of stock markets over a meaningful period of time. Increasingly, however, the surrounding narrative is sensational and designed to garner attention by tapping into the very emotions which undermine effective investment decisions. So while the narrative can be very dramatic, actually the best response, probably based upon long-term evidence, is to sit tight, do nothing, and allow markets to recover as they are sure to do. Now I'm going to finish up with these two guys. You've got Adolf Lowe, who is an economist, who's on the left, and you've got Ralph Elliott, who was an accountant, and he's on the right. And both of these worked in the early part of the previous century. Adolf Lowe focused on identifying long-term patterns in markets called business cycles, where markets go up and down over a number of years. And Ralph Elliott really looked at, were there predictable patterns that investment managers and traders could use? The important point is that they really identified that a fall in markets is important for markets to achieve a new high. Now, what's interesting in the current narrative is that this is conspicuously absent. And it's important for investors on the basis that what it really gives us is an authoritative and substantive input to our narratives and therefore our attributions and our investment decisions, which probably actually gives us reason for optimism about where we're going in the longer term, because a dip now probably predicates a higher peak in markets in the longer term. Now, just in case you don't believe me, here is 100 years of US stock market data with all of the then unprecedented events picked out in it, catastrophes and crises and everything in between. And strangely, what you see is, yes, it does undulate, but over the longer term, there is a very discernible and decidedly upward trend. So what have we learned today? Well, stock markets undulate in value, and sometimes they do so dramatically. But this is part of the normal function of stock markets, and they tend to trend upwards consistently in a reliable pattern in the medium to longer term. In the shorter term, however, there is a growing preponderance of very sensational narrative which can impact how we feel, which could then impact our investment decisions and tend to make us do things that might not be in our best interests. But ultimately, based on all the available evidence, the best strategy remains to sit tight, do nothing, and on that basis, let's not panic just yet. There you go, that's the end of the first lecture, and all it remains for me to do is to sign off with the inevitable disclaimer. I won't read the whole thing, but importantly, the material here is intended to inform, educate, and entertain, and most certainly does not constitute advice. And on that note, we'll see you next time.